Please, my son can't breathe. Just let me ride with you to the hospital. Elena Vance stood in the middle of a brutal Chicago blizzard, her 4-year-old son, Leo, shaking uncontrollably in her arms. Cars passed. Nobody stopped. Leo's chest heaved with shallow, broken gasps as his severe asthma closed his airways. His small face was turning a terrifying shade of pale blue, his tiny fingers clutching her coat before slowly going still. Elena had already tried to order a ride 3 times, but her card had been declined every single time. She had called urgent care. She had pounded on a neighbor's door. She had screamed for help at 2 passing cars in the freezing night. Then, the black SUVs turned onto the street. Elena saw power before she saw faces, long, dark, armored vehicles. She stepped directly into the icy lane anyway. Tires hissed and crunched on the sleet. The first SUV rolled past, but the second stopped hard in front of her. A large man in a dark coat jumped out of the front passenger seat, moving toward her fast. "Back away from the vehicle," he ordered. "My son needs a hospital," Elena said. "Move." She didn't move. The rear passenger window slid down. A man sat inside, radiating absolute, freezing authority. His eyes moved once over Elena, then to the boy. "No," Vincent Romano said. Elena stared at him as if she hadn't heard correctly. "Please, I said no." Then his expression hardened further, as if her mere presence had offended his ruthless logic. "Do you know how many people try this?" he said, his voice cutting through the howling wind. A crying woman, a sick child in her arms, a story meant to make a man hesitate. Snow hit the side of the SUV in sharp, swirling bursts. Elena said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes dissecting her. "I've been lied to by women like you before. I've seen children used as props. I've seen fake blood, fake bruises, fake tears, fake emergencies." His jaw tightened. "So don't stand there wasting my time. Say what this is." For a second, Elena forgot the biting cold, forgot everything except the humiliation burning up her throat. If Leo had not been gasping for air against her chest, she might have broken down. Instead, her fear sharpened into pure, analytical anger. "This is my son dying," she stated coldly. The guard stepped closer. "Ma'am." "He can't breathe," Elena snapped, not taking her eyes off the man in the back seat, refusing to be intimidated by his aura. "I don't want your money. I don't want your name. I need a hospital." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "That's what they all say first." Suddenly, Leo let out a thin, tearing wheeze. His head rolled weakly against Elena's shoulder. Elena looked down fast. "No, Leo, no. Stay with me, baby." When she looked up again, there was no pride left in her face, only terror. "Look at him," she demanded. The man didn't answer. "Really? Look at him." His eyes dropped again to Leo. The boy's lips were losing the last of their color. One tiny hand had slipped free of the blanket and hung limp against Elena's wrist. Still, he did not move. Then, abruptly, he pushed the door open himself and stepped out into the freezing storm. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs. Up close, he looked worse than dangerous. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life learning never to trust what he saw first. He glanced at Elena. "What's his name?" "Leo." "How old?" 4. "How long has he been like this?" His asthma triggered when the heating broke in our building. It got worse. He can barely breathe now. "Please." His eyes narrowed into slits. "Where's the father?" Elena stared at him in disgust. "Gone." "Convenient." Her voice shook, but her gaze was defiant. "You think I would stand in a Chicago blizzard with my child suffocating just for a lie? I think people do worse for less." Leo made another weak, choking sound. Everything inside Elena snapped. Her brilliant mind bypassed any instinct of submission. "I don't care what you think," she fired back. "I don't care what people have done to you or how many lies you've heard. But if you have the power to suspect the whole world, you should have the power not to be afraid of a dying 4-year-old. If you drive away and he dies, that will be your cowardice, not my lie." The guard looked at her sharply, completely shocked that she had dared to say it. The Mafia Boss went completely still. Snow gathered on the hard line of his broad shoulders and his sharp jaw. For one long, agonizing second, Elena thought he might explode, or turn and leave, or have his guard throw her into the snowbank. Instead, his dark gaze dropped to Leo again. Then he looked at the guard. Open the door. The heavy door swung open. Elena did not hesitate. She tightened her grip on her son and climbed into the back of the massive vehicle. The absolute silence inside hit her first. The thick armor plating and double-paned glass completely erased the howling wind of the blizzard outside. Then came the heat. It was a suffocating, expensive warmth that smelled of rich leather and the faint, crisp scent of cedar and danger radiating from the man who slid in beside her. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in. The convoy surged forward immediately, tires gripping the icy pavement with mechanical precision. Vincent reached beside him, picked up a heavy dark wool overcoat, and tossed it across her lap. "Wrap the boy," he commanded. Elena obeyed instantly, cocooning Leo in the thick fabric. Her hands trembled violently from the residual cold, but her movements were incredibly exact. Vincent leaned forward, his voice a low, lethal murmur that carried to the front seats. "Call ahead. Tell the emergency room we are coming in hot. Pediatric respiratory failure. If there is a single second of delay when we arrive, tell them I will hold the hospital board personally responsible." "Yes, boss," the driver responded without missing a beat. The SUV tore through the frozen streets, disregarding red lights and traffic laws. In the dim glow of the street lamps flashing through the tinted windows, Vincent turned his dark gaze back to the woman sitting beside him. He expected the usual reaction. He expected her to collapse into hysterics, to weep loudly, to drown in panic now that she was temporarily safe from the storm. Instead, he witnessed something that made his sharp mind pause. Elena was not crying. Her pale face was completely devoid of chaotic emotion. She had slipped into a state of pure, clinical focus. She positioned Leo carefully against her chest, tilting his small head back just enough to keep his airway as open as possible. She pressed her ear to his chest, timing the terrible, raspy intervals of his breathing. Her lips moved silently as she counted his heartbeats, analyzing his physical decline. She was not a weeping victim. She was acting with the cold, calculated precision of a professional who refused to let reality dictate her defeat. "He needs oxygen," Elena stated, her voice devoid of tears, offering a factual medical assessment rather than a desperate plea. "His chest retractions are getting deeper. We have less than 10 minutes. Vincent narrowed his eyes. The sheer intellect radiating from her desperate situation was a stark contrast to the poverty of her soaked clothes. "If this turns into a staged performance," he warned softly, the threat hanging heavily in the warm air, "you will deeply regret stepping into my vehicle." Elena did not even look at him. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on Leo. "I am trying to keep my son alive," she replied, her tone perfectly even, completely unaffected by his intimidation. "I do not have the luxury or the energy to entertain your paranoia. Just drive." No one spoke to Vincent Romano like that. Men had lost their lives for displaying a fraction of the defiance this freezing, destitute mother just showed him. Yet, as he watched her steady, intelligent hands gently massage the boy's rigid chest to stimulate breathing, Vincent found himself leaning back against the leather seat. He said nothing else. He simply watched her, realizing with calculating clarity that the woman he had just led into his world was not a sheep seeking a shepherd. She was something entirely different, something forged in a quiet, unbreakable kind of steel. The heavy vehicle swept beneath the brightly lit canopy of the emergency entrance, stopping with aggressive precision. The rear door was opened from the outside before Elena could even reach for the handle. 2 nurses and a senior pediatric resident were already waiting on the frozen pavement, flanked by a gurney. Vincent Romano did not make requests, and the hospital staff moved with the frantic, terrified efficiency of people who understood exactly whose vehicle had just arrived. "Bring the boy," the resident ordered sharply. Elena stumbled out into the biting wind, clutching Leo tightly to her chest. The world instantly narrowed to blinding white lights, the violent thud of her own heartbeat, and the chaotic squeak of rubber wheels on linoleum. The medical team peeled back the dark wool coat, took one look at the violent struggling of the 4-year-old boy's chest, and called for an oxygen mask before anyone asked a single question. Elena tried to stay close, but a nurse blocked her path just long enough to strap a pulse oximeter onto the boy's tiny, pale foot. "What is his name?" the nurse asked rapidly as they pushed the gurney down the hall. "Leo," Elena answered, her voice breaking for the very first time. "Age 4. Severe asthma. He had a fever this afternoon." They were moving too fast. Experienced, clinical, and detached. Leo disappeared through a set of heavy double doors marked pediatric intensive care, and Elena instinctively lunged forward to follow. A different nurse caught her firmly by the arm. "You need to wait here, ma'am," the woman said gently but firmly. "They need room to work." Elena stopped. That sentence nearly broke her knees. It was reasonable, and reasonable words had a way of cutting deeper than cruelty when a mother's child was on the other side of a locked door. She stood in the middle of the bright, sterile waiting area, soaked from head to toe, the heavy wool coat slipping off her shoulders. Water dripped from her jeans onto the polished floor. Across the room, Vincent had entered. He did not rush. He did not hover. He stood just outside the harsh spell of the hallway lights, his dark coat absorbing the glare. He was speaking in a low tone to a man in a navy suit who looked like the hospital chief administrator. The administrator was nodding furiously, his posture rigid with a mixture of awe and sheer panic. No one ignored Vincent Romano. Staff detoured around him, giving him a wide berth reserved for authority that was far too dangerous to question. A woman with a clipboard and a sympathetic but tired expression approached Elena. "Miss Vance," the woman said softly, "I need to gather some admission information while they stabilize your son." Elena swallowed hard, her analytical mind immediately recognizing the shape of the impending disaster. "Yes. Do you have an active insurance provider?" The question landed like a physical blow. Elena gripped her own hands together to stop them from shaking. "I do not have active coverage right now," she answered, her voice dropping. The woman paused, her pen hovering over the paperwork. "I see. We will still need his date of birth, your current address, and we will need to discuss the deposit for emergency pediatric admission. The financial department requires a baseline payment before he is transferred to a recovery ward." Elena felt the familiar, crushing weight of poverty closing in on her throat. It was the American shape of tragedy. A child saved first, followed by a bill massive enough to ruin whatever small life remained around that child. She had exactly $30 in her checking account. Before Elena could form a sentence to beg for a payment plan, a shadow fell over the clipboard. Vincent had crossed the waiting room. He stopped beside Elena, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, but far enough not to crowd her. "The billing is handled," Vincent stated. It was not a comforting reassurance. It was a command disguised as a fact. The admissions woman looked up, her eyes widening as she recognized the man standing there. "Of course, Mr. Romano," she stammered, immediately lowering the clipboard. "I apologize, I did not realize she was with you. I will update the file immediately." The woman practically fled back to her desk. Elena turned sharply to look at him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, stinging pride. "I did not ask you to pay for this," she said quietly, ensuring her voice did not carry. Vincent looked down at her. His expression was completely unreadable. "You asked me to get him here," he replied. The answer was incredibly clean, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I cannot repay a pediatric intensive care bill," Elena pressed, her chin lifting defiantly. "I will not be indebted to a man like you." "I did not offer you a loan, Elena." His tone was perfectly flat, completely devoid of mockery or pity. That somehow unsettled her far more than if he had demanded something cruel. Men who wanted something usually made their motives obvious. Vincent gave nothing away. He did not show interest, he did not show kindness, he only delivered results. Your son needs oxygen and highly specialized monitoring, Vincent continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Care costs money. This is not a complicated equation. It is complicated to me. His gaze hardened, a flash of deep impatience breaking through his controlled facade. Because your pride is cheaper than his treatment. Elena flinched. The words hit their mark with devastating accuracy. You think I am proud? She whispered fiercely. I threw myself in front of a moving armored vehicle in a blizzard. Then stop arguing with me about a hospital bill. He shot back, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an intensity that demanded absolute submission. If that boy leaves this facility without the exact care he requires because you're afraid of owing me a favor, that becomes your selfishness, not your nobility. Elena stared at him, her breath hitching. She hated him in that exact moment because her brilliant mind knew he was entirely right. He was stripping away her final defense, bypassing her consent entirely, and drawing a hard, cold line in the sand. He was not rescuing her. He was taking control. A young, exhausted-looking doctor pushed through the double doors, a stethoscope still looped around his neck. Miss Vance, he called out. Elena pivoted so fast she nearly lost her footing. Your son is stable, the doctor said, offering a tight, relieved smile. His oxygen levels were critically low, but he is responding well to the bronchodilators. We need to keep him overnight in a specialized pediatric suite to monitor his lungs, but he is going to be all right. Elena closed her eyes. The sterile room tilted precariously as the sheer force of relief washed over her. She reached blindly for the edge of a plastic chair to steady herself. She did not realize Vincent had moved until his large, warm hand closed firmly around her upper arm. His grip was strong enough to keep her from collapsing, yet brief enough to avoid any illusion of intimacy. He held her steady until she opened her eyes again, proving that while he had completely bypassed her pride, he was the only solid thing keeping her tethered to the ground. The young pediatric doctor motioned for Elena to follow him slightly down the corridor, moving away from the chaotic traffic of the emergency room. Vincent remained exactly where he stood, his towering presence acting as a silent, immovable weight pressing against the sterile white walls. Leo is resting comfortably now, the doctor explained in a hushed, serious tone. We administered heavy intravenous steroids to drastically reduce the airway inflammation, and his oxygen saturation is finally climbing back to normal levels. However, his lungs have sustained a massive amount of stress tonight. He is incredibly vulnerable right now. Elena nodded slowly, her brilliant mind automatically processing and categorizing the medical data despite her overwhelming exhaustion. When can I take him home? She asked. The doctor hesitated, his eyes dropping to the thick medical file in his hands. We need to keep him for another 12 hours for continuous observation. After that, he can technically be discharged, but I must be absolutely clear with you, Miss Vance. He requires an impeccably clean, consistently warm environment to recover. No drafts, no dampness, no sudden temperature drops. If he catches a secondary respiratory infection or is exposed to severe cold in his current state, his lungs will simply shut down entirely. He will not survive a second attack like the one he suffered tonight. The clinical words fell upon Elena like concrete blocks. She felt the remaining blood drain entirely from her face. She thanked the doctor mechanically, turned around, and walked back toward the harsh fluorescent glare of the waiting area. She sank slowly into a hard plastic chair. Her mind, usually so sharp and capable of solving complex problems, slammed into a massive, impenetrable wall. Her run-down apartment on the south side was currently sitting at 40 degrees. The negligent landlord had ignored her desperate maintenance requests for 3 weeks. The thin glass windows rattled violently in the winter wind, and there was a persistent, toxic dampness in the plaster walls that she could never scrub away. Taking Leo back to that freezing box was an absolute death sentence. taking him to a crowded, underfunded city shelter filled with hundreds of sick, coughing people was equally fatal. Vincent Romano watched the exact moment the devastating reality settled over her rigid shoulders. He possessed an uncanny, predatory ability to read the architecture of a person's despair. He walked across the linoleum floor and stood directly before her, clad in his dark wool overcoat, radiating absolute certainty. "You cannot take him back to your apartment," Vincent stated. It was not a question. It was a factual observation delivered with the force of a gavel. Elena looked up sharply. "I will figure something out," she replied instinctively, her voice brittle but defensive. "With what resources?" He countered smoothly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You have no money. Your building heat is broken. Your neighborhood is a frozen wasteland. You are completely cornered." She hated his terrifying precision. She stood up abruptly to face him, utterly refusing to cower in a plastic chair while he loomed over her like a shadow. "I said I will figure it out," she snapped. "There are emergency housing vouchers for single mothers. There are community programs that can help until I find a better job." "Waiting lists," Vincent interrupted, his voice dropping low, completely devoid of pity or artificial sympathy. "Bureaucratic delays. Overcrowded holding rooms crawling with airborne pathogens. Your son does not have weeks for you to navigate a broken social system. He has 12 hours. Elena clenched her hands into tight fists at her sides. "What is your ultimate point, Mr. Romano? You paid the emergency medical bill. You got your thrill of playing God for the evening. You can leave now." Vincent did not flinch at her venom. His expression remained carved from ice. "My point is that tomorrow morning, a secure vehicle will be waiting at the discharge entrance. You and the boy are coming to my estate." The sheer, arrogant audacity of the command left Elena temporarily speechless. "Absolutely not," she finally hissed, ensuring her voice remained low so the surrounding nurses would not hear. "I am not moving my child into the fortress of a mafia boss. I am not trading my son's fragile health for a spot in your personal menagerie. I know exactly how men like you operate. You do not offer sanctuary. You offer cages." Vincent took one slow, deliberate step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his calculating stare. "Do not flatter yourself, Elena," he said softly, the syllables striking her like cold steel. "If I wanted to cage you, I would not have waited for a blizzard to do it. I am offering an entirely sterile, temperature-controlled suite where a team of private physicians can monitor the boy around the clock. You will have a solid roof. You will have absolute security. And what do you get out of it?" she demanded, her analytical mind searching frantically for the hidden trap. Men who rule criminal empires do not turn their massive estates into charitable wards. "What is the price for this warmth?" "The price," Vincent replied evenly, "is that you stop insulting my intelligence by pretending you have a better option. I saw exactly what you did in the back of my vehicle tonight. You are smart, calculating, and ruthless when it comes to keeping your son breathing. Yet right now, you are letting a pathetic sense of lower-class pride dictate your logic." Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. He was dismantling her emotional defenses not with brute force, but with the very cold logic she prided herself on. "If you refuse," Vincent continued relentlessly, his dark gaze pinning her in place, "you take a medically fragile child back into a frozen ruin. You risk his life simply because you are terrified of what it means to accept my resources. That makes you a massive hypocrite. It means your pride matters significantly more than his lungs." Silence stretched between them, thick and incredibly volatile. The rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors down the hall felt deafening in the heavy quiet. Elena looked away from his piercing stare, her eyes focusing on the heavy double doors of the pediatric intensive care unit where her son lay tethered to life-saving machines. She thought of Leo's terrifyingly blue lips. She thought of the wet rattling sound in his small chest. She thought of the frost forming on the inside of her bedroom window at home. Vincent Romano was a dangerous, ruthless monster. He was deeply entrenched in a world of violence and shadows. But right now, his world was the only one on Earth that possessed the heat, the money, and the power required to keep her son breathing tomorrow. Elena turned her head back to Vincent. Her expression stripped away all trace of vulnerability, leaving behind a cold, pragmatic resolve that rivaled his own. She matched his dominant stare with equal, burning intensity. "Fine," she said, her voice completely steady and devoid of defeat. "We will go to your estate. But you need to understand this very clearly. I am doing this exclusively to keep my son alive. I am not submitting to you. I am not your employee, I am not your property, and I will never be grateful for a situation that forces me to rely on a man like you." Vincent studied her defiant face for a long, silent moment. A faint, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the hard lines of his jaw. It was not a smile, but it was a deep, silent acknowledgement of her unbroken spirit. "I expect nothing less," he replied smoothly. "The car will be waiting at 8 in the morning. Be ready." At exactly 8 in the morning, a pristine black sedan sat idling outside the hospital entrance. Elena had spent the final hours of the night sitting in a hard plastic chair, watching Leo breathe steadily through the glass of the pediatric intensive care unit. When the pediatric specialist confirmed that the private ambulance arranged by Vincent Romano was ready to transfer the boy to the estate, Elena finally stepped outside into the biting cold. A stoic driver and a broad-shouldered guard were waiting for her. They were instructed to escort her to her apartment to gather her belongings. Stepping out of the climate-controlled vehicle into the freezing slush of her neighborhood felt like stepping onto an entirely different planet. The violent contrast between the sleek, armored sedan and the decaying brick facade of her apartment building was physically nauseating. The hallway smelled heavily of stale cigarettes, damp rot, and boiled cabbage. When she unlocked her door, the absolute freezing temperature of the room hit her instantly. She could see her own breath suspended in the stale air. Frost had formed on the inside of the thin window panes. On the small, chipped kitchen table sat a chaotic pile of brightly colored envelopes. Final disconnection notice. Eviction pending. Past due medical bills. She stared at the paperwork that had completely consumed her waking nightmares for the past year. In the presence of the silent, imposing guard standing in her doorway, the threats printed on those papers suddenly felt incredibly hollow. She ignored them entirely. Elena grabbed a faded duffel bag and packed with ruthless, clinical efficiency. She did not pack her own threadbare clothes or any sentimental trinkets. She only took what her son required to survive. His prescription inhalers, his favorite worn-out stuffed bear, his medical records, and the few warm sweaters he owned. She left the broken space heater. She left the cheap dishes. She left the suffocating anxiety of poverty trapped in those damp walls. She zipped the bag, took one final look at the freezing, miserable box that had been her entire world, and walked out without a single ounce of regret. The drive out of the city was thick with heavy silence. Elena watched through the deeply tinted glass as the landscape shifted dramatically. The crumbling infrastructure and crowded streets of the south side dissolved into sprawling, snow-covered properties hidden behind towering wrought iron gates and dense winter forests. She was acutely aware that she was crossing an invisible, highly dangerous border. She was entering a hidden world built on blood, violence, and absolute power. She was trading one brutal form of survival for another. Yet, her pulse remained remarkably steady. Fear was an expensive luxury she could no longer afford to entertain. The vehicle finally slowed, turning into a massive private driveway flanked by dark stone pillars and high-tech security cameras. The heavy gates glided open flawlessly, revealing the Romano estate. It was not merely a mansion. It was a sprawling fortress carved from slate and glass, exuding a suffocating aura of impenetrable wealth and lethal isolation. When the heavy oak front doors opened, Elena was not greeted by Vincent. Instead, an older woman standing with impeccable posture in the grand foyer awaited her arrival. The foyer itself was designed to intimidate, featuring sweeping marble staircases, priceless antique rugs, and vaulted ceilings that echoed with an oppressive, disciplined silence. The woman wore a tailored black dress and a severe, unyielding expression. "I am Beatrice," she announced, her voice crisp, cultured, and commanding. "I manage this household and all its staff." Elena met her gaze directly, utterly refusing to be cowed by the sheer opulence surrounding them or the authority in the older woman's tone. "I am Elena," she replied evenly, her voice steady. "Where is my son?" "He arrived safely via the medical transport," Beatrice answered, her sharp eyes scanning Elena from head to toe with rapid precision. "He is currently resting in the South Wing under the direct supervision of our private medical team. I will take you to his suite." As they walked down the incredibly long, carpeted corridors, Beatrice watched the young mother very closely. The head housekeeper had survived 3 decades in the criminal underworld by reading people with flawless accuracy. Most women brought into this estate by Vincent Romano behaved in highly predictable patterns. They stared at the crystal chandeliers with undisguised greed. They trailed their fingers over the expensive silk wallpaper. They simpered for favor, or they cowered in overwhelming terror. Elena did absolutely none of those things. Her eyes did not linger on the priceless Renaissance art lining the walls or the gold fixtures. Instead, her brilliant mind was clearly working at terrifying speed. Her gaze flicked methodically to the security cameras tucked into the corners of the ceiling. She noted the heavy reinforced fire doors, the spacing of the reinforced windows, and the exact architectural routes that could be utilized as potential exits. She moved with the calculated, hyper-vigilant caution of a seasoned soldier entering unfamiliar, hostile territory. "You pack very lightly, Miss Vance," Beatrice observed smoothly, glancing at the single, worn duffel bag gripped tightly in Elena's hand. "I only brought what is medically necessary to keep my child breathing," Elena replied without breaking her brisk stride. "Everything else in my past is completely useless to me now." Beatrice paused for a fraction of a second. A flicker of genuine, profound respect broke through her rigid professional facade. In exactly 3 sentences and a few minutes of observation, the head housekeeper realized a critical truth. Vincent Romano had not brought home a desperate, fragile victim to be easily manipulated or discarded. He had brought home a woman whose intellect and sheer force of will were just as dangerous as his own. "Follow me," Beatrice said, her tone dropping its harsh edge, softening just a fraction into something resembling solidarity. "Let us get you to your son." The South Wing suite was not a guest room. It was a clinical sanctuary wrapped in velvet and mahogany. When Beatrice opened the heavy double doors, the first thing Elena heard was the steady, reassuring rhythm of a state-of-the-art cardiac monitor. Leo lay in the center of an enormous, pristine bed, a delicate oxygen cannula resting gently beneath his nose. A private physician in a crisp shirt stood nearby, logging vital signs onto a digital tablet. Elena did not sleep that first night. She sat in a high-backed leather chair near the window, her eyes fixed completely on the gentle rise and fall of her son's chest. The air in the room was perfectly filtered, set to an exact, unvarying temperature. It was a suffocating level of safety, purchased with currency she did not understand and from a man she fundamentally did not trust. By morning, the pale winter sun broke through the heavy curtains. Leo opened his eyes and asked for water without the terrifying wheeze that had haunted them for weeks. His skin had regained its natural, healthy warmth. That single, tiny improvement was enough to solidify Elena's resolve. She would endure anything in this fortress to maintain that warmth. However, enduring did not mean submitting. After a lavish breakfast was brought to the suite on a silver tray, the sheer idleness of the luxurious environment began to crawl under her skin. She had spent the past 4 years fighting for every single breath and every single dollar. Being treated like fragile glass or a kept woman was an insult to her survival instincts. Leaving Leo under the watchful eye of the private pediatric nurse, Elena ventured out into the sprawling corridors. She found Beatrice directing staff near a massive, 2-story library. The room was breathtaking, filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes, historical texts, and stacked estate archives that looked deeply neglected by the modern operations of the syndicate. "I need something to do," Elena stated quietly, approaching the head housekeeper. Beatrice raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "You are a guest of Mr. Romano. Guests are not required to labor." "I am not a guest," Elena replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I am a mother holding onto a lifeline. If I sit idle in that suite, I will lose my mind. Let me catalog this library. I have an advanced academic background in research and archival organization. I can digitize and categorize this entire collection using a logical indexing system." Beatrice studied her for a long moment, recognizing the desperate need for purpose burning in the young woman's eyes. "Very well," Beatrice conceded. "The historical financial ledgers and architectural blueprints from the previous century are in absolute chaos on the second tier. You may start there." For the next 3 hours, Elena buried herself in the work. Her brilliant mind thrived on creating order from chaos. She rapidly sorted decades of complex documents, building a flawless cross-reference system. It was not manual labor. It was a sharp display of high-level intellectual competence. She was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by neatly stacked folios, when the heavy library doors opened. The footsteps that approached were measured, confident, and entirely silent on the thick Persian rug. "I must admit," a man said, his voice smooth and cultured, "I did not expect to find our mysterious new resident elbow-deep in the estate archives." Elena stood up, smoothing the front of her simple sweater. The man standing before her was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. He appeared to be in his early 40s, handsome in a refined, aristocratic manner that contrasted sharply with Vincent's raw, intimidating power. "I am Marcus Sterling," he said, offering a warm, perfectly practiced smile. "I serve as the chief advisor to Mr. Romano. I handle the intricate details of his various enterprises." Elena met his gaze. "I am Elena." Marcus tilted his head, his eyes sweeping over the meticulously organized stacks of documents around her. "You have a very analytical approach to a rather tedious task, Elena. Most people in your highly fortunate position would prefer to enjoy the spa facilities." "I prefer to be useful," she answered neutrally. His smile widened, but Elena felt a sudden, distinct chill trace its way down her spine. Her academic background in psychology had trained her to read human behavior with clinical accuracy. The warmth on Marcus Sterling's face was entirely artificial. The muscles around his eyes remained completely rigid. His gaze was not welcoming. It was cold, calculating, and deeply invasive. He was dissecting her, trying to determine exactly what kind of threat or opportunity she represented in the complex hierarchy of the Romano Empire. "How admirable," Marcus murmured, stepping just a fraction of an inch too close. "Vincent rarely brings outsiders into the inner sanctum. You must possess a very unique set of talents to warrant such an unprecedented exception." The probing nature of his comment was unmistakable. He was elegantly fishing for the nature of her relationship with the boss, attempting to categorize her as a mistress or a pawn. "My only talent is keeping my son alive, Mr. Sterling," Elena replied, her voice dropping to a cool, professional register that effectively built an invisible wall between them. "Mr. Romano provided a medical necessity. There is nothing more to analyze." Marcus held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. The polite mask never slipped, but the predatory glint in his cold eye sharpened. "Of course," he agreed smoothly. "I am sure we will be seeing quite a lot of each other. Do let me know if you require anything at all." He turned and exited the library, leaving a faint scent of expensive cologne in his wake. Elena stood perfectly still, her highly tuned instincts screaming a silent warning. Vincent Romano might be a terrifying, overt monster, but Marcus Sterling was something far more insidious. He was a wolf dressed in immaculate sheep's clothing, and she knew instantly that he was going to be a severe problem. "How admirable," Marcus murmured, stepping just a fraction of an inch too close. "Vincent rarely brings outsiders into the inner sanctum. You must possess a very unique set of talents to warrant such an unprecedented exception." The probing nature of his comment was unmistakable. He was elegantly fishing for the nature of her relationship with the boss, attempting to categorize her as a mistress or a pawn. "My only talent is keeping my son alive, Mr. Sterling," Elena replied, her voice dropping to a cool, professional register that effectively built an invisible wall between them. Mr. Romano provided a medical necessity. There is nothing more to analyze. Marcus held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. The polite mask never slipped, but the predatory glint in his cold eye sharpened. "Of course," he agreed smoothly. "I am sure we will be seeing quite a lot of each other. Do let me know if you require anything at all." He turned and exited the library, leaving a faint scent of expensive cologne in his wake. Elena stood perfectly still, her highly tuned instincts screaming a silent warning. Vincent Romano might be a terrifying, overt monster, but Marcus Sterling was something far more insidious. He was a wolf dressed in immaculate sheep's clothing, and she knew instantly that he was going to be a severe problem. The following morning, Elena left the clinical sanctuary of the South Wing to seek out a simple cup of coffee. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the estate, her mind still buzzing with the unsettling implications of her encounter with Marcus Sterling. She found the formal breakfast room bathed in cold winter sunlight. The long mahogany table was set with pristine porcelain and polished silver, a stark reminder of the immense wealth that funded her son's every breath. She poured her own coffee, pointedly ignoring the hovering staff. Just as she lifted the cup, the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels echoed on the marble floor. Victoria Blake entered the room like a localized weather event. She was a woman constructed entirely of generational wealth and aggressive vanity. Clad in a tailored white cashmere suit that cost more than Elena had earned in a decade, Victoria possessed the kind of striking, aggressive beauty that was usually deployed as a weapon. She stopped in the doorway, her icy blue eyes locking onto Elena with immediate, undisguised contempt. "Well," Victoria drawled, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. "I heard Vincent picked up a stray from the slums, but I truly did not expect someone quite so painfully ordinary." Elena took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. She did not flinch. She recognized the archetype instantly. Her academic background in sociology had required extensive study of class dynamics and predatory social behavior. Victoria was a textbook example of a fragile ego masked by financial privilege. "I am Elena," she replied evenly, setting the cup down on the saucer with a quiet clink. "I know exactly who you are," Victoria countered, stepping fully into the room and invading Elena's personal space. "You are the tragic little charity case. The desperate single mother who used a sick child as a golden ticket to bypass the gates of the Romano estate. It is a very ancient, very tired strategy. Tell me, do you plan to weep on cue every time you need a new wardrobe?" The insult was designed to provoke tears or a screaming fit. Victoria thrived on the chaotic emotional collapse of her targets. Elena provided neither. Instead, she let a heavy, suffocating silence stretch between them. She looked at Victoria not with anger, but with the detached, clinical fascination of a researcher observing an insect under a microscope. "You are deeply insecure, Miss Blake," Elena stated calmly. The words were delivered with zero malice, which made them infinitely more devastating. Victoria blinked, her perfectly painted lips parting in shock. "Excuse me? You entered this room specifically to humiliate a woman who owns absolutely nothing," Elena continued, her voice remaining perfectly level and analytical. "A woman with actual power would not waste her morning seeking out a destitute mother just to validate her own social standing. Your entire identity is clearly predicated on proximity to men like Vincent Romano. You wear expensive clothes to project authority, but your behavior reveals a terrifying lack of actual substance. You are not a queen in this empire. You are just expensive scenery." The color drained entirely from Victoria's flawless face. Her hands began to tremble with sheer, unfiltered rage. "How dare you speak to me like that, you filthy little beggar," she hissed, stepping forward with her hand raised. A voice colder than the Chicago winter sliced through the room. "Lower your hand, Victoria." Vincent Romano stood in the arched doorway. He wore a dark tailored suit, his hands resting casually in his pockets, but his dark eyes were lethal. He had been standing there long enough to witness the entire exchange. "Vincent," Victoria gasped, rapidly dropping her hand and forcing a desperate, brittle smile. "I was simply introducing myself to your new house guest. She is incredibly insolent. She needs to be taught her place." Vincent walked slowly into the room. He did not look at Victoria. His gaze was fixed entirely on Elena. He had watched Elena dismantle a ruthless socialite not with shouting or tears, but with a terrifyingly precise psychological vivisection. He saw the cold logic in her eyes, the brilliant, unbroken mind operating beneath the surface of her quiet demeanor. "Her place is exactly where she is standing," Vincent said softly, the absolute finality in his tone echoing off the high ceilings. "Your place, Victoria, is in a vehicle heading back to the city. You are no longer welcome in this house today." Victoria recoiled as if she had been physically struck. "But Vincent," she stammered, her facade crumbling completely. "Leave," he commanded softly. Victoria turned on her heel and fled the room, her composure entirely shattered. The heavy dining room doors swung shut, leaving Elena and Vincent completely alone in the sprawling space. Elena did not look away from him. She did not offer gratitude or an apology for causing a scene. She simply picked up her coffee cup and took another measured sip. Vincent stopped on the opposite side of the mahogany table. He studied her face, the realization settling deep into his calculating mind. He had thought he was bringing home a fragile liability, a woman he needed to shelter. He had been completely wrong. He had brought a razor-sharp intellect into his fortress, a woman whose mental architecture was just as ruthless and disciplined as his own. "You do not require a bodyguard, Miss Vance," Vincent noted quietly, a shadow of genuine intrigue darkening his eyes. "You require a larger battlefield." Elena met his stare with absolute calm. "I only fight wars that threaten my son, Mr. Romano. Everything else is just background noise." Over the next 10 days, the oppressive, suffocating tension that had gripped Elena slowly began to recede. In the pristine environment of the South Wing suite, Leo was no longer tethered to the supplemental oxygen monitor. He sat up in his large bed, coloring with crayons that Beatrice had discreetly provided, his breathing quiet, deep, and beautifully even. Elena watched him from the doorway, her heart settling into a steady, sustainable rhythm for the very first time in months. Her primary objective was secured. Now she needed to secure her tactical position. Sitting idle in a fortress built on blood and shadow was dangerous. Ignorance, she knew, was always fatal. She returned to the massive 2-story library every single afternoon. The archival project she had initiated with Beatrice was not merely busy work to pass the time. It was a meticulous excavation. She organized decades of financial ledgers, property deeds, and complex offshore corporate structures. Her mind, deeply trained in data analysis and behavioral patterns, began to detect an anomaly. It was incredibly subtle. A team of seasoned forensic accountants looking at individual documents would have missed it entirely. But Elena was looking at the entire ecosystem, and she saw the microscopic, deliberate fractures in the foundation. A series of commercial shell companies registered under the estate's logistics division showed erratic capitalization over the past 2 years. The rotting numbers tied back directly to operations managed by Marcus Sterling. The funds were not missing, which was why no alarms had been raised. Instead, the operational costs were being artificially inflated and then systematically bled out through phantom consulting fees and hyper-inflated transport tariffs. It was a brilliant, highly sophisticated embezzlement structure designed to siphon millions while appearing completely solvent and productive on the surface. Marcus entered the library late on a Tuesday afternoon. His tailored suit was immaculate, his smile perfectly polished, but his cold eyes darted immediately to the specific leather-bound shipping ledgers spread across her mahogany desk. "You are working incredibly hard, Elena," Marcus observed smoothly, stepping closer and invading her personal space. I would deeply hate for you to strain yourself with irrelevant historical data. Those shipping records from 3 years ago are entirely obsolete. Let me have the staff clear them away for you." Elena looked up, her expression a flawless mask of placid academic focus. "Oh, they are not obsolete at all, Mr. Sterling. I am simply tracking the evolutionary patterns of the estate holding companies. It is absolutely fascinating how the routing protocol shifted so dramatically 24 months ago. The logistical overhead tripled, yet the physical cargo volume remained entirely static. It is a very creative, highly unusual economic model. For a fraction of a second, the aristocratic warmth vanished entirely from Marcus Sterling's face. His jaw locked. The silence in the room turned instantly toxic, heavy with unspoken threats. "Some models are complex for a reason," he replied, his voice dropping its friendly cadence, replacing it with a quiet, lethal edge. "I strongly suggest you focus your considerable intellect on the older, historical archives, Elena. Modern operations are deeply sensitive." "I only organize what I am given," she answered neutrally, offering a polite, vacant smile. He left the room, his footsteps noticeably faster and heavier than usual. Elena knew immediately that she had just painted a massive target on her own back. Marcus was a predator, and she had just tapped on the glass of his cage. That evening, she did not wait to be summoned. She actively sought out Vincent Romano. She found the Mafia Boss in his private study, a room bathed in the low glow of a crackling fireplace and the scent of expensive bourbon. He was reviewing legal documents, his dark suit jacket discarded over a leather chair, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to expose the corded muscle of his forearms. He looked up as she entered unannounced. He did not reprimand her for the intrusion. He simply watched her approach the heavy desk, his dark eyes calculating her every move. "Mr. Romano," Elena began, her voice steady and deliberate. "I have encountered an organizational anomaly in the library archives. I require your guidance on how to properly file certain logistical ledgers." Vincent leaned back, his gaze narrowing with intense, predatory focus. He knew Elena Vance did not ask for guidance. She solved problems. "Speak," he commanded softly. She placed a single sheet of paper on his desk. It was not a stolen ledger or a copied document. It was a hand-drawn flowchart she had created entirely from memory. It mapped the exact, convoluted flow of the phantom consulting fees routing through Marcus Sterling's shell companies. "I am struggling to categorize these specific transport subsidiaries," Elena stated, her tone purely academic, devoid of any accusatory emotion or dramatic flair. "The capital allocation does not match the physical asset depreciation. From a purely structural standpoint, this architecture resembles a slow, deliberate hemorrhage. If I were grading this as a university economic thesis, I would conclude that the architect is quietly preparing to dismantle the host organism from the inside out." Vincent looked down at the handwritten chart. The silence in the study grew incredibly heavy, thick with sudden, violent realization. He did not explode. He did not shout or sweep the contents off his desk. His mind moved with lethal, terrifying speed, instantly verifying the mathematical and logistical truth in the diagram she had drawn for him. He slowly raised his eyes from the paper to look at her. The atmosphere between them shifted profoundly in that exact moment. It was not fueled by physical desire, superficial charm, or the typical power dynamics of a captor and his captive. It was the electrifying, magnetic recognition of a matching intellect. She had just handed him the blueprint of a massive internal betrayal orchestrated by his right-hand man, and she had done it without raising her voice, without making emotional demands, and without showing a single ounce of fear. "Marcus recommended I stop looking at these specific files this afternoon," Elena added quietly, holding his intense stare. "He mentioned they were highly sensitive." Vincent picked up the piece of paper, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the edge. "He recommended that, did he?" "Yes." Vincent stood up slowly, planting his hands flat on the desk and leaning forward, bringing his face closer to hers. The dangerous aura surrounding him was almost palpable, a contained explosion waiting for a trigger, but none of that lethal energy was directed at her. "You have a terrifyingly beautiful mind, Elena," he murmured, his voice a dark, resonant rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. "I have a survival instinct," she corrected smoothly, absolutely refusing to break eye contact or step back from his overwhelming presence. "I cannot maintain a secure environment for my son if the foundation of this estate is rotting from the inside out. I am simply pointing out the rod." Vincent held her gaze, a dark, primal respect solidifying deep in his chest. He saw her brilliance, her absolute loyalty to her child, and her fearless logic. "Consider it pointed out," Vincent said softly, his eyes flashing with a cold, absolute promise of violence. "Leave the rest to me." 2 days after the quiet revelation in the study, a thick cream envelope sealed with dark wax was delivered to the South Wing suite. Beatrice handed it to Elena with a solemn expression. Inside, printed in sharp silver foil, was an invitation to the annual Winter Benefactor Gala hosted by the Romano Foundation. It was the premier social event of the Chicago elite, a glittering, highly publicized masquerade where the city's wealthiest figures gathered to launder their reputations through high-profile philanthropy. Vincent arrived at the suite an hour later. He stood in the doorway, watching Leo peacefully build a tower of wooden blocks on the thick carpet. The boy's breathing was completely silent, his cheeks flushed with healthy color. Vincent then shifted his dark gaze to Elena, who was holding the cream envelope. "You are attending the gala with me tonight," Vincent stated. It was delivered with his usual flat authority, a command disguised as a simple fact. Elena set the invitation down on the small table. "I am not a socialite, Mr. Romano. I have absolutely no desire to be paraded in front of a ballroom full of predators who view my son's medical crisis as an opportunity for a tax deduction." Vincent stepped fully into the room, his towering presence demanding her complete attention. "You are attending because the Romano Foundation requires a tangible, undeniable narrative of charitable success," he explained coldly. "The foundation heavily funds the pediatric intensive care unit that saved your son. There are certain political figures and external auditors attending tonight who need to see exactly where that money is going. You are the proof." Elena crossed her arms, her sharp mind analyzing the tactical layout of his request. "You want me to play the grateful, weeping mother for the cameras," she noted, her tone laced with dry skepticism. "Absolutely not," Vincent countered, his eyes locking onto hers with intense, magnetic focus. "Weeping mothers are pitted and immediately forgotten. I need you to do exactly what you did to the archival ledgers. I want you to walk into that ballroom and analyze every single board member, every politician, and every associate who smiles at Marcus Sterling. I do not need a piece of fragile arm candy. I need your eyes, Elena. I need your intellect in that room." The proposition struck a deep, resonant chord within her. He was not asking her to be a prop. He was asking her to act as a highly specialized operative in his shadow war. She looked at Leo, whose life depended entirely on the structural integrity of the Romano Empire. If Marcus Sterling succeeded in his silent coup, the medical funding would vanish instantly. "Fine," Elena agreed, her voice dropping to a cool, professional register. "But I will not wear whatever ostentatious costume your associates usually provide for these events. I am not a piece of rented property." Vincent gave a short, singular nod, his expression flashing with dark approval. "Beatrice has already been instructed to accommodate your exact preferences. Be ready by 8 o'clock. The afternoon blurred into a tense, highly orchestrated preparation. Beatrice brought a curated selection of evening gowns to the suite. They were all breathtakingly expensive, but Elena ruthlessly rejected the sheer fabrics, the plunging necklines, and the heavy, vulgar displays of diamonds that were clearly designed to showcase a woman as a purchased commodity. She finally selected a gown crafted from heavy, midnight blue silk. It was a masterpiece of architectural tailoring. The dress featured lawn, fitted sleeves, a high, elegant neckline, and a completely open back. It draped her slender frame with liquid grace, completely devoid of sequins or excess embellishment. It was not a dress meant for seduction. It was armor forged in elegance. Beatrice pinned Elena's dark hair into a sleek, flawless twist at the nape of her neck, leaving her sharp jawline and high cheekbones completely exposed. A single pair of delicate sapphire drop earrings was the only jewelry allowed. When Elena finally looked in the full-length mirror, the exhausted, desperate mother from the freezing apartment was entirely gone. The woman staring back radiated an icy, unapproachable power. She looked like a sovereign entity preparing to step onto a battlefield. Shortly before 8 o'clock, Elena walked down the sweeping grand staircase of the foyer. The rhythmic click of her heels echoed in the cavernous space. Vincent was waiting at the base of the stairs. He wore a bespoke black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders with lethal perfection. The stark black and white of his formal attire only amplified the terrifying, predatory aura that always surrounded him. He turned as he heard her approach. For a long, suspended moment, Vincent Romano went completely still. His dark eyes swept upward, taking in the midnight blue silk, the severe, elegant line of her posture, and the cold, brilliant intelligence burning in her gaze. He did not look at her with the crude, shallow lust that men usually directed at beautiful women. He looked at her with a profound, consuming reverence. She had utterly defied the expectations of his world. She did not look like a dependent charity case or a fragile victim. She looked like an absolute equal. "You are early," Vincent murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to physically touch her from across the floor. "I do not like to keep my variables waiting," Elena replied smoothly, reaching the bottom step and meeting his intense stare without a single flinch. Vincent offered his arm. It was a traditional gesture, but the weight behind it felt like a formal alliance. "Are you prepared to face the wolves, Miss Vance?" Elena rested her hand lightly on his dark sleeve. Her pulse was perfectly steady. "The wolves should be deeply concerned about facing me, Mr. Romano. Let us go." The ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a cathedral of gold leaf and predatory intent. As Elena moved through the sea of silk and diamonds beside Vincent, she felt the weight of 1,000 eyes dissecting her. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she used her sharp, analytical mind to catalog the room. She saw the way the city's elite leaned toward Vincent with practiced greed, and the way they looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and cold dismissal. She was an outlier in their carefully curated ecosystem, a mother from the slums dressed in midnight blue armor. 20 minutes into the evening, the string quartet's melody was severed by a voice that made Elena's entire body turn to ice. "Still know how to pick your moments, don't you, Elena?" She turned slowly, her hand tightening on the stem of her water glass. Standing a few feet away was a man who looked like a hollow imitation of success. Connor Hayes was dressed in a black tuxedo that fit him too perfectly for a man who had never held a steady job. He looked well-shaved and polished, but his eyes were the same weak, shifty eyes she remembered from the night he had walked out on a pregnant woman and an empty refrigerator. "What are you doing here, Connor?" Elena asked, her voice low and deadly calm. The room began to go quiet. Conversations died as the scent of a scandal filled the air. Marcus Sterling appeared at the edge of the circle, his expression one of polite, artificial concern, while Victoria Blake stood nearby with a smile like a razor blade. "I am here to stop a lie," Connor shouted, his voice carrying across the ballroom. He gestured Dong by toward Elena, then toward the high-definition screens displaying the Foundation's charity work. "You all see a tragic story," he told the crowd. "But I see the woman who stole my son. She disappeared with Leo and used his illness to crawl into the bed of a billionaire." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The predatory elite angled closer, their appetites whetted by the sudden blood in the water. Connor took a step forward, his face twisted into a mask of wounded fatherhood that Elena knew was a lie. "I stayed quiet because I was ashamed," he lied to the room. "But I cannot watch my son be used as a prop for a mafia boss's reputation." Elena always had a plan. She knew exactly how to use that boy to get what she wanted. Victoria Blake stepped forward, her honey blonde hair shimmering under the chandeliers. How unexpectedly domestic, she purred, her eyes fixed on Elena with triumphant cruelty. It seems the charity case has a very complicated history. Elena felt the room tilt. The high ceilings and gold trimmings seemed to shrink, pressing in on her. She looked at Marcus Sterling and saw the flicker of absolute satisfaction in his gaze. He had found her ghost and brought it to life. She looked at the faces of the donors and board members, people who had been praising the foundation seconds ago, and saw only disgust. They were no longer looking at a mother. They were looking at a child thief, a gold digger, a woman who had commodified her own son's suffering. "You are a coward and a liar," Elena stated, her voice trembling but her posture remaining rigid. "You left us with nothing." Connor laughed, a greasy, familiar sound. "I left because you made it impossible to stay," he countered, playing his role perfectly for the audience Marcus had provided him. "And now I find you here, in a dress that costs more than our son's life, playing the queen in a house filled on blood." The whispers began in a low, hungry rush. The elite crowd, the donors, and the politicians shifted their weight, their judgment settling heavily on Elena Vance. In their world, she was no longer a success story. She was a stain. The whispers in the Drake Hotel ballroom swelled into a suffocating crescendo, a venomous tide of judgment crashing over Elena. She stood in the center of the gilded space, the midnight blue silk of her gown suddenly feeling like the garments of the condemned. Every eye in the room shifted from Connor Hayes and his fabricated performance to the towering figure standing right beside her. They were waiting for the king to speak. Elena turned her head slightly, her brilliant mind seeking the one anchor she thought she had secured. She looked at Vincent Romano. She did not expect a romantic, dramatic rescue. She expected the ruthless, instantaneous destruction of a lie. She expected the man who had ordered an entire hospital to bend to his will to simply raise his hand and silence the rabid dogs circling her. But Vincent did not move. He stood with his hands resting casually at his sides, his broad shoulders perfectly relaxed, his posture screaming absolute control. Yet, he said absolutely nothing. His dark, predatory eyes were not looking at Connor with the blinding rage of a protector. They were dissecting the room. His gaze flicked rapidly from the sweating, pathetic figure of Connor Hayes to the deeply satisfied, polished face of Marcus Sterling standing in the periphery. Vincent was not acting as a shield. He was acting as a mafia boss. His terrifyingly sharp intellect was currently processing the exact sequence of events that had allowed a desperate loser like Connor to bypass the estate security detail. He was calculating the exact leverage Marcus Sterling had used to choreograph this public assassination. He was playing an intricate, high-stakes game of chess, mapping out his retaliatory strikes for the coming days. But in his cold, calculating delay, he committed the most fatal error of his entire life. He left her undefended. 1 second passed. The silence stretched, tight and brittle. 2 seconds passed. Victoria Blake smiled, her cruel expression widening as she interpreted Vincent's silence as a tacit admission of Elena's guilt. 3 seconds. In the brutal ecosystem of the criminal underworld, 3 seconds of tactical observation was a necessity. But in the fragile architecture of human trust, 3 seconds was an eternity. It was the exact amount of time required to completely shatter a foundation. Elena watched the calculations running behind his dark eyes, and a profound, devastating clarity washed over her. She realized the ultimate truth about the man she had begun to trust. He would always be an emperor first. He would always evaluate the structural integrity of his empire before he defended the honor of the woman standing beside him. When a powerful man had to pause to analyze whether or not to destroy a threat against you, you had already lost his protection. The cold logic of her own mind snapped violently into place, freezing the last remnants of vulnerability in her chest. She did not shed a single tear. She did not look at Vincent again. She belonged entirely to herself. Elena pivoted smoothly away from the towering mafia boss and closed the distance between herself and Connor Hayes in 3 measured, terrifyingly calm steps. Connor opened his mouth, preparing to launch into another rehearsed line of sympathetic victimhood, but the words never materialized. Elena raised her hand and delivered a strike across his face with such sudden, explosive force that the sharp crack echoed violently off the vaulted ceilings. The entire ballroom flinched. The string quartet halted entirely. The whispers died instantly, leaving a vacuum of absolute, stunned silence. Connor stumbled backward, his hand flying to his rapidly reddening cheek, his weak eyes wide with genuine shock. He had expected her to weep, to beg, to be crushed under the weight of the elite crowd. He had not expected the vicious, clinical retaliation of a woman who had fought death itself in a freezing apartment. "You disgusting, pathetic coward," Elena stated. Her voice was not a scream. It was a low, lethal vibration that carried flawlessly through the dead quiet of the room. It was the voice of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. Connor tried to recover his posture, his eyes darting to Marcus for support, but Marcus had suddenly taken a step back, recognizing the volatile shift in the atmosphere. "You disappeared when your son was taking his very first breaths," Elena continued, her words striking like physical blows. "You left us with a broken heater and empty cupboards. You do not care about his life. You care about the money you were undoubtedly paid to stand in this room and recite a script." She turned her piercing gaze away from Connor, sweeping her eyes over the sea of donors, board members, and finally letting them rest directly on Marcus Sterling and Victoria Blake. "I am not here to steal your wealth," Elena declared, her tone ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. "I am here because my 4-year-old son cannot breathe without the medical machinery funded by this foundation. I traded my anonymity for his survival. If any of you believe that makes me a villain, while you sip imported champagne and plot against each other in your expensive suits, then your judgment means absolutely nothing to me. I do not need your acceptance. I only needed a hospital." She did not wait for a response. She did not look back at the people staring at her in stunned silence. And most importantly, she did not look back at Vincent Romano. Elena Vance turned her back on the entire empire. She walked across the polished marble floor of the ballroom with her head held high, the midnight blue silk of her gown trailing behind her like a royal standard. She walked out of the opulent doors and into the freezing Chicago night, leaving the king standing in the ruins of his own calculation. The freezing wind coming off Lake Michigan hit Elena the moment she stepped through the brass doors of the Drake Hotel, but it was nothing compared to the absolute winter inside her chest. Snow had begun to fall in thick, swirling sheets, coating the pavement in a treacherous layer of white. She did not stop to ask for a coat. She simply kept walking toward the line of idling black vehicles. "Elena," a voice commanded. It was not a request. It was the lethal, vibrating tone of a man who owned the city, but Elena did not stop. Vincent caught up to her before she reached the curb. His large hand closed around her bare arm. The contrast of his burning heat against the freezing night air was jarring. He turned her around, his dark eyes blazing with a mixture of raw fury and something that looked terrifyingly like panic. "Let me go," she stated, her voice as hard and brittle as ice. "You are acting entirely on emotion," Vincent fired back, the snow gathering on the broad shoulders of his tuxedo. "You need to look at what just happened logically. Marcus orchestrated that ambush. If I had reacted blindly, I would have shown him exactly how to dismantle me. I needed 3 seconds to map the threat." Elena ripped her arm out of his grasp. "You did not map a threat, Vincent. You weighed my value against your empire. I was assessing the architecture of the betrayal," he insisted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural rasp. "I know you did not sell that boy. I know exactly who you are." "Then you should have spoken," Elena yelled, her analytical composure finally cracking under the sheer weight of the betrayal. She pointed a trembling finger at his chest. "You stood there and analyzed the room while I was being torn apart. You demand absolute loyalty. You demand total submission to your protection, but your protection comes with a waiting period. When you had to calculate whether or not to trust me, you completely lost the right to protect me. Vincent went entirely still. The absolute truth of her words struck him with more force than a physical blow. For a man who controlled every variable in his existence, he had completely miscalculated the one thing that actually mattered. He had applied the cold mechanics of a mafia war to the fragile trust of a mother, and in doing so, he had shattered it. "Take me back to my son," Elena commanded, her voice dropping back to a terrifyingly flat register. The drive back to the Romano estate was suffocating. They sat in the back of the armored SUV in absolute, unbroken silence. The physical distance between them on the leather seat was only a few inches, but the chasm separating their worlds had grown infinitely vast. The moment the heavy front doors of the estate opened, Elena bypassed the grand foyer entirely. She walked straight to the south wing suite, her midnight blue gown sweeping across the carpets. Leo was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in perfect, healthy rhythm. Elena did not hesitate. She walked directly to the closet, pulled out the faded duffel bag she had brought from the slums, and began packing with frantic, mechanical precision. "Miss Vance." Beatrice stood in the doorway. The head housekeeper took one look at the open duffel bag, the discarded evening heels, and the severe, unyielding expression on Elena's face, and understood exactly what was happening. "We are leaving," Elena said without looking up, shoving a stack of Leo's sweaters into the bag. "You are doing no such thing," Beatrice replied, stepping fully into the room and closing the heavy oak door behind her. Elena zipped the bag with a violent jerk. "You cannot keep me here. He cannot keep me here. I will not raise my son in a house where my dignity is collateral damage for a mafia power struggle." Beatrice walked across the room and placed her hand firmly over Elena's trembling fingers, stopping her movements entirely. "Look out the window, Elena," the older woman instructed softly, her voice devoid of any judgment, laced only with heavy, practical truth. Elena looked. The blizzard was raging violently outside, whipping the bare trees into a frenzy. The temperature was dropping well below zero. "You are brilliant," Beatrice continued, her eyes holding Elena's fierce gaze. "You are perhaps the smartest woman who has ever walked through those front doors. But right now, your pride is making a deeply fatal calculation. If you take a 4-year-old boy with severe respiratory trauma out into a sub-zero blizzard tonight, he will be dead before you reach the city limits." The words drained the frantic energy right out of Elena's body. Her knees buckled slightly, the sheer exhaustion of the evening finally catching up to her. She looked at the heavy duffel bag, then looked at her sleeping son. Beatrice was entirely right. Fleeing into the freezing night was not survival. It was a suicide mission born of shattered pride. Elena slowly removed her hand from the bag. She closed her eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. "I am only staying until the storm breaks," she whispered, the fight leaving her shoulders. Beatrice nodded slowly, offering a rare, solemn look of profound respect. "Stay the night. Keep him warm. Tomorrow, the world will look very different. Because while you are packing a bag, Vincent Romano is tearing his empire down to the studs." Elena opened her eyes, looking at the older woman. "I do not care what he does to his empire." Beatrice moved toward the door, turning back just once before leaving the room. "You will," she noted quietly. "Because men like him do not apologize with words, Elena. They apologize with absolute ruin." Vincent Romano did not sleep. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his private study, watching the violent Chicago blizzard tear through the estate grounds. A glass of untouched amber bourbon sat on his heavy mahogany desk. He was a man who had built an empire on calculated restraint, but tonight, that exact restraint had cost him the only thing he had ever genuinely respected. Beatrice had been entirely correct. He did not possess the vocabulary for a traditional apology. His language was violence, structure, and the absolute removal of obstacles. He had paused for 3 seconds in that ballroom to assess a threat. Those 3 seconds had shattered Elena's trust. He could not undo the pause, but he could annihilate the men who had orchestrated it. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the heavy doors of the study opened. For of his most trusted, Lethal enforcers entered the room. They were the men who operated strictly in the shadows, completely separate from the polished corporate facade managed by Marcus Sterling. "Do you have him?" Vincent asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that competed with the howling wind outside. "Yes, boss," the lead enforcer replied. "We intercepted him exactly 3 blocks from the hotel. He was trying to secure transport to the airport." "Bring him to the lower holding level," Vincent commanded. Connor Hayes was not a hardened criminal. He was a greedy, pathetic opportunist who crumbled the absolute second the temperature in the concrete basement dropped. When Vincent walked down the cold stone steps 10 minutes later, he did not even need to raise a weapon or raise his voice. The sheer, suffocating aura of the Mafia Boss standing under the harsh fluorescent bulb was enough to completely break the coward. Connor wept, spilling the entire architecture of the plot. He confessed to receiving a massive cash deposit to memorize the script and ambush Elena at the gala. With shaking hands, he surrendered a secure cellular device containing encrypted messages and offshore routing numbers. Vincent took the device back to his study and handed it directly to his internal forensic technology team. Within 2 hours, the encrypted routing numbers were fully decoded. They matched the exact anomalous financial structures Elena had identified in the library archives just days earlier. The phantom consulting fees, the inflated logistics tariffs, the deeply buried shell companies. It all led back to a single, undeniable source: Marcus Sterling. Marcus had recognized the severe threat Elena posed the exact moment she began organizing the historical ledgers. He knew her brilliant, analytical mind would inevitably uncover the millions he had been systematically siphoning from the Romano Logistics division. To protect his silent coup, Marcus needed to discredit her completely. He needed to paint her as a manipulative opportunist so Vincent would expel her from the estate before she could formally present her findings. Vincent stared at the digital confirmation illuminating the dark room. The betrayal was absolute. His most trusted advisor, the man who stood by his right hand for a decade, had not only stolen from the syndicate, but had dared to use Elena and a sick 4-year-old boy as collateral damage in his treason. A cold, terrifying calm settled over Vincent Romano. The calculating, restrained businessman vanished entirely, replaced by the ruthless, undisputed king of the underworld. He looked at his lead enforcer. "Lock down the entire estate," Vincent ordered softly, his dark eyes reflecting the harsh glow of the monitor. "No one enters. No one leaves. Send a security detail to collect Marcus from his city penthouse. Bring him directly to the main boardroom at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. Do not let him know he is a dead man walking." The enforcer nodded and vanished into the shadows. Vincent turned back to the window, watching the storm finally begin to break over the frozen city. He had failed to protect Elena from the public ambush, but he would ensure the men responsible never breathed the same air as her again. The era of observation was over. The era of absolute ruin had begun. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the Romano estate buried under 3 feet of pristine, glittering snow. But inside the sprawling mansion, the atmosphere was completely devoid of peace. It was a suffocating, lethal quiet. Heavy security details stood at every corner, their postures rigid, their weapons visible. The estate had transitioned overnight from a luxurious sanctuary into a fortified military compound. At exactly 7:30 in the morning, a soft knock sounded at the door of the South Wing suite. Beatrice entered, her expression even more severe than usual. "Mr. Romano requests your presence in the main boardroom," Beatrice stated quietly, her eyes flicking toward the bed where Leo was sitting up, happily eating a bowl of oatmeal. Elena stopped folding a small sweater. She looked at the head housekeeper, her sharp mind instantly analyzing the weight of the summons. "What is happening downstairs?" "Justice," Beatrice replied simply. "And I strongly suggest you witness it." Elena instructed the private pediatric nurse to lock the suite doors from the inside and not to open them for anyone but herself. She smoothed the dark fabric of her simple skirt and followed Beatrice down the sweeping staircase. The main boardroom was located deep within the administrative wing of the estate. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a massive mahogany table and frosted glass windows that blocked out the winter sun. When the heavy doors swung open, the suffocating tension in the room hit Elena like a physical wall. Vincent Romano stood at the head of the long table. He had discarded the polished veneer of the corporate billionaire entirely. He wore a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the stark, corded muscle of his forearms. His expression was not angry. It was a terrifying, absolute void. He was no longer a businessman evaluating a contract. He was the apex predator of the Chicago underworld, and he was ready to feed. Seated along the table were the architects of the previous night's disaster. Marcus Sterling sat on the right, his aristocratic face pale, but desperately holding onto a mask of composed confusion. Across from him sat Victoria Blake, clutching a designer handbag, her eyes darting nervously around the room. At the far end of the table, flanked by two massive enforcers, sat Connor Hayes. He was shivering violently, his tuxedo stained with sweat and dirt from the lower holding level. Elena walked into the room, her spine perfectly straight. She did not look at Connor. She did not look at Victoria. She walked directly to the empty leather chair positioned immediately to Vincent's right, the traditional seat of the second in command. Vincent did not offer it to her, but he did not stop her from taking it. Her silent claim of that specific territory sent a visible shockwave through Marcus. "We are all gathered," Vincent began, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that commanded absolute silence. "Let us discuss loyalty." Marcus cleared his throat, attempting to project his usual smooth authority. "Vincent, I am deeply confused by this sudden meeting. Why is this pathetic liar sitting at our table?" Marcus gestured toward Connor. Vincent did not answer immediately. He reached down and picked up a thick, leather-bound folio. He opened it and slowly slid 3 distinct documents across the polished mahogany. They came to rest directly in front of Marcus. The first document was a printed transcript of the encrypted messages Connor had surrendered in the basement. The second was a detailed schematic of the Phantom Logistics accounts. The third was the exact hand-drawn flowchart Elena had created in the study 2 days prior. Marcus looked down at the papers. The immaculate, confident mask he had worn for a decade cracked, revealing the panicked, trapped animal beneath. "You spent 2 years siphoning capital through the transport subsidiaries," Vincent stated, his tone completely devoid of emotion. "I tolerated a certain level of aggressive accounting because you are useful. But then you realized Miss Vance possessed an intellect capable of dismantling your entire financial labyrinth in a single afternoon." Victoria Blake gasped softly, suddenly realizing that she had been summoned not as a valued ally, but as a convicted conspirator. Vincent turned his dark, lethal gaze to Marcus. "To protect your theft, you purchased this coward." He pointed a single finger at Connor and orchestrated a public assassination of a mother and a sick child. "You used my foundation and my gala to execute a hit on my own territory." "Vincent, please listen to reason," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking as he stood up, his hands flat on the table. "She is an outsider. She is a distraction. I built the logistical backbone of this empire. You cannot throw away a decade of brotherhood over a woman you met in a blizzard." Vincent did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "I am not destroying you over a woman, Marcus. I am destroying you over treason." Vincent gave a singular, almost imperceptible nod to the enforcers standing near the door. What followed was incredibly swift and entirely bloodless in front of Elena, yet it radiated pure, psychological terror. A lawyer stepped forward and placed a stack of corporate dissolution forms on the table. Marcus was forced to sign away every single asset, property, and offshore account he possessed, transferring them entirely back to the Romano estate. He was systematically stripped of his wealth, his authority, and his identity. When the signatures were complete, the enforcers gripped Marcus by the arms. "Where are you taking me?" Marcus demanded, his aristocratic facade shattering into raw, unadulterated fear. "Vincent, please." Vincent did not even look at him as he was dragged toward the heavy doors. "You are no longer my concern, Marcus. The streets of Chicago will decide your fate now." The doors slammed shut, sealing Marcus Sterling's doom. He would not survive a single week without the protection of the syndicate he had just betrayed. Vincent then turned his attention to Victoria Blake. She was trembling violently, tears ruining her flawless makeup. "Your accounts are frozen, Victoria," Vincent announced coldly. "You are permanently blacklisted from every charitable board, social club, and financial institution affiliated with my name. If I ever see you near my properties again, I will ensure your family legacy is reduced to absolute ash. Get out." Victoria fled the room, sobbing hysterically. Only Connor remained. He fell to his knees, begging for his life, begging for mercy for the sake of his son. Elena looked at the man who had abandoned Leo to freeze. She felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a cold, clinical detachment. "You do not have a son," Elena stated quietly, her voice cutting through his pathetic weeping. "You forfeited that title the night you left us." Vincent looked at the enforcers. "Put him on a freight train heading west. If he ever crosses the Illinois state line again, throw him in the river." Connor was dragged away, his pleas echoing down the hall until the heavy doors sealed shut once more. The massive boardroom was suddenly completely empty, save for Vincent and Elena. The silence was absolute. The Empire had been purged, the rot violently extracted. Vincent stood at the head of the table, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. He had proven his lethality, but as he turned to face the woman sitting in the chair to his right, he knew the true test of his power had nothing to do with violence. The massive boardroom was entirely silent. The heavy oak doors had sealed shut, completely cutting off the chaos of the purged empire outside. Vincent Romano stood at the head of the polished mahogany table, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. He turned his head and looked at Elena Vance, who remained seated in the chair to his right, her posture as flawless and unyielding as carved marble. Vincent did not approach her with the desperate, chaotic energy of a man begging for redemption. He walked slowly around the edge of the table and stopped a few feet away from her chair. He looked down at her, his dark eyes stripped of all their usual calculating armor. "I am not going to offer you poetic apologies, Elena," Vincent said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that filled the quiet room. "Words are a cheap currency, and you are far too intelligent to accept them." Elena met his gaze. Her face was a mask of perfect composure, but her brilliant mind was evaluating every single syllable he spoke. She waited. "Yesterday in that ballroom, I reacted as the head of a syndicate," Vincent continued, his tone carrying a heavy, brutal honesty. "I paused to analyze the architecture of a threat when I should have been annihilating the threat entirely. I treated your dignity as a variable. It was the greatest miscalculation of my entire life." He took one final step closer, looking at her with a profound, consuming reverence. "I tore my inner circle apart this morning not just to punish treason, but to prove a fact," he stated softly. "You and your son are no longer variables in my world. You are the foundation. If you remain here, you will never have to wonder if my protection comes with a waiting period. You have my absolute, unwavering steadiness." Elena looked into the depths of his dark eyes. She searched for any lingering trace of the arrogant, detached emperor who had demanded her submission in the back of an armored vehicle. She found absolutely none. She found only certainty, immense respect, and the heavy, immovable truth of a man who had permanently altered his reality to accommodate hers. Steadiness was the only currency she had ever truly wanted. "Power is completely useless if it arrives late," Elena replied quietly, her voice ringing clear in the vast space. "If I stay in this house, Vincent, I am not staying as your dependent charity case. I am not of fragile weakness to be locked away in the south wing for safekeeping." Vincent felt a rare, genuine spark of warmth ignite deep in his chest. He saw the fierce, independent queen sitting before him, holding her ground against the undisputed king of the city. "I would burn this entire estate to the ashes before I ever asked you to stand behind me," Vincent vowed, the absolute finality of his words hanging in the air. "You're my equal, Elena. In this room, and in every room we ever enter." The bitter Chicago winter continued to blanket the world outside the frosted glass, but inside the fortress, the freezing cold had finally been permanently banished. Elena thought of her 4-year-old son sleeping peacefully upstairs, his lungs perfectly clear, his future secured by an impenetrable wall of wealth and devotion. She looked at the terrifying, brilliant man who had just dismantled his own empire simply to prove his loyalty. "Then we have an agreement," she answered softly. It was not a fragile, tearful romance born from a fairy tale. It was a profound, unbreakable alliance forged in intellect, mutual respect, and a shared, ruthless determination to protect what was theirs. This story reminds us that true dignity can never be stripped away by poverty, harsh circumstances, or the malicious judgment of others. It teaches us a powerful humanistic lesson that the greatest form of love and protection is not found in grand, dramatic gestures, but in absolute, unwavering steadiness. When the world turns against you, the people who truly matter will not hesitate to stand by your side. Power, influence, and wealth mean absolutely nothing without the courage and loyalty to fiercely protect those we hold dear. How did this story make you feel? Can you relate Elena's fierce determination or Vincent's harsh realization to any challenges in your own reality? We truly desire to listen to the feelings from deep within your heart, so please share your thoughts in the comments section below. If this narrative touched your emotions, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel to listen to many more captivating videos every single day. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video robust health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye and see you in the next video.